In the spring of 1813, Thomas Ketland stood in his three-story workshop on Steelhouse Lane, Birmingham, holding a musket lock plate that bore a mark no other gunmaker in England could legally use. The small stamped crown above his surname wasn't the government's Birmingham Proof House mark. It was his own, his workshop's unique identifier, registered, recognized, and legally protected within the square mile of narrow streets that formed the gun quarter. He was 52 years old, third-generation gunmaker, and one of approximately 180 independent masters who had transformed Birmingham into the single largest firearms manufacturing center in the British Empire. The system that allowed him to stamp that mark had existed for less than a decade. Time equals 400 milliseconds greater than, and it would vanish within his lifetime, leaving behind thousands of stamped initials, symbols, and workshop marks that modern collectors would struggle to decode 2 centuries later. The gun quarter occupied roughly 1 square mile of Birmingham's northeast industrial core. Steelhouse Lane formed its eastern boundary, Weeman Street marked the south, Loveday Street defined the north. Within these streets, between 1800 and 1815, over 600 individual workshops produced firearms components. Not complete firearms, components. Birmingham's gun trade operated on a system called putting out, where a single musket passed through 15 to 20 different specialists before completion. One workshop forged barrels, another filed locks, a third cast brass furniture, a fourth assembled the complete weapon, and nearly every specialist marked their work. The practice began not from pride but from accountability. When the Board of Ordnance in London contracted for 100,000 muskets in 1804 to armed troops fighting Napoleon, they demanded traceability. If a lock failed in combat, if a barrel burst during proof, if a trigger mechanism snapped under field conditions, the military needed to know which workshop had produced the faulty component. The Birmingham Proof House, established by Act of Parliament in 1813, formalized what had been informal practice for years. Every component that could fail catastrophically, barrels, locks, receivers, had to be proved. And every component had to be marked by its maker before proof. Ketland's workshop employed 14 men. 7 worked at benches along the ground floor, filing and fitting lock components under north-facing windows that provided consistent light throughout the day. 4 operated forges in the rear building, heating and shaping metal. 2 apprentices, ages 13 and 15, operated the grinding wheel and maintained tools. 1 master engraver cut the small crown-over Ketland mark into each completed lock plate before it left the workshop. The mark measured approximately 4 millimeters square, clear enough to read with the naked eye, small enough not to interfere with the lock's function. It took roughly 30 seconds to stamp each mark using a hardened steel punch and a 2-pound hammer. The proof house itself stood on Banbury Street, a purpose-built structure with 3-foot-thick walls and a reinforced roof. Inside, proof masters subjected barrels and actions to powder charges substantially exceeding normal service loads. A military musket barrel might fire a standard charge of 165 grains of black powder behind a .75 caliber ball during combat. The proof charge used 210 grains, nearly 30% more powder, to stress test the barrel beyond any realistic field condition. If the barrel survived without bulging, cracking, or showing signs of weakness under magnification, it received the official Birmingham proof marks, a crown over crossed scepters, along with the date letter indicating the year of proof. But before that official mark went on, the maker's mark had already been struck. This created a permanent record. Ketland's crown over surname on the lock plate, the proof house's crown over scepters on the barrel, and often a third mark, the assembler's mark on the stock or trigger guard. A single musket might bear 5 or 6 different workshop marks by the time it reached military inspection. The system worked because Birmingham's gun trade operated on reputation. A master gunmaker like Ketland might never see the soldier who fired his locks in battle, but he would certainly hear from the military contractors if his work failed. Failed proof meant lost income. Time equals 300 milliseconds greater than returned locks meant reputational damage. Within the gun quarter's tight geography, word traveled fast. A workshop that produced substandard work found contracts drying up within weeks. The marks weren't decorative. They were insurance policies carved in steel. By 1815, the variety of marks in use had become staggering. Some makers used their full surnames. Others used initials. Some incorporated crowns, lions, or other royal symbols. A few used numbers, 1, 2, 3, to distinguish different quality grades from the same workshop. Joseph Egg, working from premises on Pall Mall by 1815, but originally from the gun quarter, used a distinctive egg-shaped oval around his surname. The Wesley Richards family used a simple WR in a rectangular cartouche. Samuel Galton used interlocking initials SG with a small star above. The complexity came from scale. Between 1804 and 1815, Birmingham workshops produced approximately 1.8 million military pattern muskets for British and Allied forces. That's an average of 163,000 muskets per year, or roughly 450 complete firearms per day leaving the gun quarter. Each one marked multiple times, each mark requiring a registered punch tool, each punch tool requiring periodic replacement as the striking face wore down. The Proof House maintained a register of authorized marks, but the register itself became a sprawling document, with new workshops registering marks quarterly as the gun trade expanded to meet wartime demand. The marks also evolved. A workshop that began in 1805 might register a simple initial mark. By 1810, after establishing reputation, the same workshop might register a more elaborate mark incorporating their full name and a symbol. If the workshop changed ownership through inheritance, sale, or partnership dissolution, a new mark would be registered. Thomas Ketland's workshop, for instance, had used 4 different marks between 1795 and 1815 as the business passed through family members and incorporated new partners. Some marks indicated specialization. A workshop that forged only barrels might use a mark that incorporated a barrel profile. Time equals 400 milliseconds greater than /A lock filer might include a tumbler or mainspring in the design. These weren't required, but they served as informal advertisement. A military inspector examining a lock marked with a detailed symbol knew he was looking at specialized work, not general production. The marks also revealed Birmingham's international connections. By 1810, gun quarter workshops were producing firearms for Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and various German states, in addition to British forces. Export weapons sometimes received different marks, simplified versions without royal symbols that might be politically problematic for foreign clients. A musket bound for Portuguese forces might have Ketland's standard mark on the lock, but neutral merchant mark on the barrel, allowing the weapon to pass through multiple hands without revealing its British military origins. The system began to break down after 1815. With Napoleon defeated at Waterloo, military contracts collapsed almost overnight. Birmingham's gun trade contracted by approximately 60% between 1815 and 1820. Workshops that had employed 15 men reduced to 4. Specialists who had filed locks for a decade found themselves unemployed. The Proof House continued operating. Civilian firearms still required proof, but the volume dropped dramatically. Many workshops simply closed. Their registered marks disappeared with them, leaving no record except the thousands of stamped components scattered through military arsenals across Europe. By 1830, the workshop-specific marking system had largely vanished. Consolidation replaced specialization. Larger manufacturers like the Birmingham Small Arms Company, established in 1861, brought multiple processes under one roof. Instead of 20 workshops contributing to a single musket, one factory produced the complete weapon. The mark simplified. A single manufacturer's mark replaced the complex web of specialist stamps. The BSA mark, a distinctive piled arms symbol, became more recognizable than any individual workshop identifier. The old marks survived only on the weapons themselves. Military muskets remained in service for decades. A musket proved in 1812 might serve in garrison duty through the 1840s be sold as surplus. In the 1850s and end up in civilian hands by the 1860s. Each one still carrying Ketland's crown mark, or Egg's oval, or Galton's interlocked initials. Marks that by then meant nothing to anyone except the diminishing number of old gunmakers who remembered the workshops. The Proof House archives retained the original mark registers, but even those created problems. The registers recorded marks as simple line drawings, rough sketches showing the general design. But they didn't capture the subtle variations that developed as punch tools wore and were recut. A mark registered in 1808 might look slightly different when stamped in 1814, even though legally it was the same mark from the same workshop. Modern researchers examining original firearms sometimes find marks that don't quite match the archived drawings, leading to decades of confusion about attribution. Some workshops had registered multiple marks simultaneously. A large operation might use one mark for military contracts, another for civilian work, and a third for export production. The registers recorded all three, but didn't always clearly indicate which mark applied to which product category. This meant a single workshop like Ketland's might have 3 or 4 variations of crown over surname marks in the official record, with no clear guidance on which was which. The geographic concentration of the gun quarter made mark registration even more complex. Steelhouse Lane alone housed approximately 30 gun-making workshops in 1813. Many used similar names, variations on Smith, Jones, Richards, Wilson. The marks had to be distinctive enough that inspectors could differentiate between Thomas Smith at number 14 and William Smith at number 28. This led to increasingly elaborate designs, with added symbols, different letter styles, and varying cartouche shapes, all trying to achieve visual distinction in marks that measured less than half a centimeter across. The end came gradually, then suddenly. Through the 1820s and 1830s, older masters like Ketland continued using their traditional marks from habit and pride. But younger gunmakers, entering a contracting trade with fewer military contracts, saw less value in maintaining expensive registered punch tools. By 1840, many simply used generic marks, a crown, initials, nothing that required registration or fees. The Proof House continued requiring marks for proof, but enforcement of registration requirements weakened. By 1850, the system had effectively collapsed into informal practice. The gun quarter itself began to dissolve. Workshops converted to other trades. The narrow streets that had housed hundreds of specialists became mixed-use industrial areas. By 1900, only a handful of gunmakers remained in the original square mile. The Birmingham Small Arms Company had relocated to new facilities in Small Heath. The older workshops, the 3-story buildings with north-facing windows and rear forges, were demolished or converted to warehousing. What remained were the marks themselves, thousands of muskets, rifles, pistols, and gun components scattered through museums, private collections, and military arsenals worldwide, each one carrying small stamped symbols that had once meant workshop identity, maker reputation, and legal accountability. By the early 20th century, most of those marks were effectively anonymous. Collectors could identify major makers, Ketland, Egg, Richards, but hundreds of smaller workshops had left no record except their stamped initials. Modern research has recovered some of this lost information. Proof House archives. Census records, trade directories, and military contracts have allowed researchers to identify approximately 400 of the estimated 600 workshops operating in the gun quarter between 1800 and 1830. But 200 remain unknown. Their marks appear on surviving firearms with no way to determine which workshop struck them, which master owned the punch tool, or where on Steelhouse Lane or Weeman Street they maintained their benches. The system represented something larger than simple quality control. For roughly 30 years, Birmingham's gun trade operated as a distributed network of specialists, each maintaining individual accountability through permanent marks. It was industrial production without industrial concentration. Mass manufacturing while preserving artisan identity, a moment when scale and specialization coexisted before consolidation made individual workshops obsolete. Thomas Ketland died in 1835. His workshop on Steelhouse Lane continued under new ownership until 1847, then closed. The building was demolished in 1852. The punch tools that struck his distinctive crown-over-surname mark disappeared with the workshop, but the mark itself survived on tens of thousands of lock plates, still legible, still carrying his workshop's identity forward into a century that no longer remembered what it meant. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about craftsmen who marked their work when marks still mattered. Real people, real trades. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if you've ever examined an old firearm and wondered about the marks. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Thomas Ketland and the gun quarter specialists don't disappear into silence. These craftsmen deserve to be remembered. Time equals 400 milliseconds / greater than, and you're helping make that happen.